Hi everyone, you're here sewing with Cody and Pete. And in today's video, we are working with foot number 12 and number 12C, the bulky overlock feet. So let's take a closer dive in to these feet and what wonderful things we can create with these awesome feet. And as always, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and always stay tuned for more videos that we're always releasing throughout the week. All right, let's see what these wonderful feet can do. So here we are with the bulky overlock feet. So with this particular foot, we have two variants. We have one that's designed for the 5.5mm and one that's designed for the 9mm. Now something that's different about these, because most feet that are 5.5mm and 9mm, they're just one smaller than the other. However, this one is quite different. So if we just look at the face of them, if we notice this one, the 12C, has a hole in the front of it. So this is excellent for couching. So you can couch a semi-decent sized cord opposed to some of the other cording type feet. And here we don't have that. And also the 12 has a slit so you can easily pull your thread underneath and behind your foot. The 12C does not. Also with the 12C, it's a bigger foot quite naturally because it is a C, but also it has a much bigger gap underneath. So when we're making piping, we can use a slightly larger cord with the 12C opposed with the regular 12. Now, something that is very similar is that they are both great for making piping, but also they're great for sewing bulkier fabrics. And that's because one side of the foot is thicker than the other. So you would ride the thicker fabric on this side of the foot. And so this side of the foot would still come in contact with either the thinner layer of the fabric or the feed dogs themselves, and it will even out the foot and help feed the fabric. And the same applies to the regular 12. So one of the things that the number 12 foot is known for, and that is making piping. And not tiny piping, but decent sized piping, kind of like what you would put on a pillow. So here I've got some 3/16 inch piping, and this is definitely probably the thickest piping you can use, especially with the number 12C foot. And remember, the number 12 foot can't take quite as big a piping. So we can easily make our own piping. So if it's just going to be straight, you don't have to cut your fabric on the bias. But if you are going to curve it around pillows, you're going to want to cut your fabric on the bias or use bias strips. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our cording, our 3/16 inch cording, fold it over, and kind of line up those raw edges all the way down. You can kind of work with it as you sew down. And you're going to place this side of the fabric on this side of the foot. And the reason behind that is because this side of the foot is a little bit thicker. So if you place on this side is actually raised up a little higher to accommodate thicker fabric. So we want to make sure that our fold, that our main fabric is on this side so it feeds evenly. Otherwise, it's going to want to drag. So we're going to then make sure our needle's moved all the way over to the right, which it is, and we're just going to start sewing. And as we're sewing, we want to make sure that this piping or this cording is being pushed all the way up against the edge here so we can get nice and tight. So there we are. Now we've got nice piping. So now we're going to actually insert this between two layers of fabric, just like we were if we're making a pillow. Okay, so here I've got two pieces of fabric. So now what we're going to do is we are going to take our piping and we're going to sandwich it in between these two layers. So depending on how much seam allowance you have to give, you may actually want to trim off some of this fabric. Because here we just started with a strip of fabric that may have been 2.5 inches wide, and we wrapped around our cording and we sewed it down to make piping. So now what we can do, we can trim off some of this excess because we want to make sure that we sew this on nice and straight. So what I like to do, I like to make sure that I'm lining up all my raw edges. So to do this properly, to make sure we don't eat up too much of our main fabric, like in case of a pillow, we may need to trim this up because we want to make sure to be able to line up the edges so we are making sure that we're sewing it on nice and straight and even. But here, we're not too worried about it because it's just strips of fabric. But that's something you're going to want to pay attention to when you are actually making something. So you could come down here and just take like your, just like your number 1 foot and kind of just stitch it down, baste it down, or you could pin it, or you can use the binding clips. And then just to make sure it stays nice and straight, because we are working with multiple layers of fabric here. So even as we're doing this, we can put some binding clips as we go along. Binding clips are wonderful. I love my pins and my binding clips. And like I've mentioned in previous videos, they are good. They're both good for different things. All right. So now we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to place our piping and our fabric underneath that groove in the foot. But something we're going to do a little bit differently. So when we made our piping, we moved our needle all the way over to the right 5 spaces. Now we're going to move it 1 space back over to the left. So this would be a 4 units to the right instead of just 5. So now we're going to sew. And the reason we moved it 1 space over to the left is because if we would have left it at that 5 spaces over to the right, we most likely would have seen that stitch that we made to sew our piping. So here, by moving it slightly over to the left, it's going to stitch to the left of that stitch and right along the edge of the piping. And if we're lucky enough to have used our binding clips and placed them along the edge, we don't have to move them. But there will come a time, especially if you don't have that much fabric to work with, they may be in the way. And you just take them off as you're sewing. So here, take these clips off. So here you can see you've got nice, beautiful piping. And like I mentioned before, this is 3/16 inch piping. This is pretty much the biggest you can fit underneath the 12C foot. And the 12C foot is the largest foot. So there you go. There is your piping. Now, if you wanted to do piping like on a pillow where you're going around the corners, there is a technique to curve that corner. And I'm going to show you later in the video. So something else we can do with this 12 and 12C foot is we can actually add cording to the edge of fabric. So here's actually a little quote sandwich that we actually worked with in the number 10 video, stitching in the ditch using those awesome cool stitches. So I just kind of trimmed this up just so I had something straight, but you would typically want to work with a finished edge. And you can work with all kinds of different cording. And here's just something I had laying around. I'm not even sure what this is. Definitely like a nylon cording of some type. And of course, you're actually going to want to, unless you want something contrasting, you're going to want thread that matches your cording. So I'm going to go ahead and change the thread in the machine real quick. All right, so I've got some black thread in the machine that just matches my cording, just so it's going to look better. So there's a little trick. I've shown this with my buttonhole foot. So there's no slit in this foot, number 12C, and of course I want my thread to go underneath, through the foot and underneath and behind it, so it's not being stitched over as I'm sewing. So I can have my machine threaded, and I can take the foot before I put it on, place that threaded needle through the opening of the foot, pull that thread down, and then attach the foot. So now my cording's behind and underneath my foot. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to place the cord right up against the fabric. We'll lower the foot, and here we're going to want to select the zigzag. So here we're going to want to select the zigzag, and we're probably going to have to make it wider. So if you have a number, if you have a Bernina 790 or like an 880, we have that nice large screen. You can tell it that you're working with that 12C foot, and you'll see that 12C foot appear on the screen. So you'll really know where and how you can adjust your stitch, because your stitch is to scale, remember? And you can really see how that stitch is going to fall in relation to the foot. So it may need some adjustments. So here I made it wider, I made it a little bit longer because it did not need to be that tight, and moved it over to the left a little bit. So let's see how that's going to work for the stitch and the application we're going to try and do. And maybe require a little bit of trial and error. All right, so let's see what we've got. Because what we're looking for is we're looking for that needle to come over to the left and bite into the edge of our fabric. And this could be finished edge fabric or any type of edge, but preferably not a raw edge like this, as I'm just trying something new. But preferably a finished edge. So this is just going to lay right along that finished edge. So it looks like my needle is actually slightly biting into my cording a little bit. So I'm going to make that stitch a little bit wider. And let's see how it looks. Because we really want that stitch to kind of overcast beyond that cord. So we want that needle to slightly bite into here and kind of overcast or just barely clip the edge of this cording. And we'll kind of pay attention to the top here and making sure that that's what's happening. So let's see what we've got. Yep, so there we are. So we were able to stitch this cording right along the edge of that little quilt. So that's a neat way. I've seen people do something like this instead of binding. So it gives you a neat kind of look, something totally different. But that's neat. That actually worked out very, very well. I'm quite surprised. And of course I would and should have put black bobbin in, but I had my deco bob in the bobbin, and that was fine, especially for the little sample to see how it would work. So this is perfect. Now what I could do, so let's take this a little further. So now let's save this stitch. So when we save this stitch, we can now come back to that saved stitch to replicate what we just did. So to do that, we have everything set how we want. So let's go to the heart. We'll go to the second icon. And then we'll say, okay, let's save it in folder 4. Now, there's already something saved in folder 4. It's one of the blanket stitches. So I can just either just click on here, and now it's going to save that stitch exactly how it is right now. So I can go and retrieve it later and not have to really worry about anything. Just use the cording and the fabric that I was working with or that I want to work with. It should be just right. You're working with the foot number 12C. So this corded edge is easily done with the number 12 or even 12C foot. Okay, as promised, I'm going to show you how to make a corner when working with piping. So when doing this, you really want to make sure you're using fabric that was cut on the bias, so it will move and stretch for you easily. So what we're going to do, we're going to use our little sample that we were working with earlier still, and we're going to come and we're going to do piping along the edge here. And then what you would do is you would then take another piece of fabric and place it on top that would match, just say if you're working with like a pillow, and you would then come stitch it around again, just like we did when we made our piping here. But the trick is here. So when we stitch it down, so let's come and stitch it down. And of course, make sure that your needle's set to stop in the down position. So we'll come stop right around here. And then what we can do is we're then going to basically need to wrap this fabric around. Looks like a mess right now. So what we'll need to do is we're actually going to clip by every 1/4 inch. Not too far up, because this will allow us to then turn our cording, because you can see that fabric flares out. So we can get and we kind of turn it so we'll be able to sew it down. I have to help it along as we rotate it. So let's see how this looks. Yeah, so we're able to nicely make this turn, and this fabric is flailing out like this. Probably need to cut a little bit further. There we are. So then what we would do is we take another piece of fabric that would match this square rectangle, lay it on top, and then stitch it down again, but closer to the piping that we made, and then we turn it right side out, and then this would be your cording, like in your pillow. Ta-da! Isn't that cool? Super easy. Super, super easy. And it's just we pivot the fabric part of the way down, and then we can clip this and then turn it and continue to stitch it just like we did originally. And that would be your corded pillow. So a corded pillow would be a whole nother class. But as for the technique, it's all about using foot number 12C or number 12. It's just you'd have to use smaller cording. So that's pretty much it with foot number 12. There are a few other little things, but those are the most popular. You can see some of my other samples that I've worked with and done in the classes before. So here's basically folding fabric over and doing corded edges, and then you kind of have like a couched look. You can easily work with, and that was just stitching the cording along the edge and then laying the fabric flat. And also here is a similar sample like we've shown, but it's working with the piping, making piping and adding it in between two layers of fabric like in a pillow. All right, so if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Stay tuned for many more videos. Check out the quilt along. And I've got tons of videos out there working with all the different feet, and I'm always adding new ones each week. So always stay tuned. So as always, happy sewing.